My name's Ethan, and up until a few weeks ago, I thought I had a pretty good life. I'm not saying it was perfect. What marriage is. But Grace and I had built something together. Something I thought was solid. Sure, we had our quirks. Grace always took the lead on small decisions, like where we'd vacation or what color to paint the living room. I didn't mind. I figured it was my way of showing her I cared. She loved that about me, or at least I thought she did. Then there was Victor, her boss. Even saying his name feels like acid on my tongue. Victor wasn't just any boss. He was the type of guy who strutted around the office like he owned not just the company but the air everyone breathed. You know the type. Calling himself an alpha, puffing out his chest as if life were some kind of endless boxing match. I always found guys like him exhausting, but I kept my opinions to myself. Grace never complained about him, so I figured he was just another blowhard she had to tolerate at work. That was until Victor decided to step out of line. Way out of line. He didn't just flirt with Grace. He made a move on her. My wife. My Grace. The audacity of it lit a fire in me that I struggled to keep contained. How could someone be so arrogant, so utterly disrespectful? I wanted to confront him right then and there, but Grace brushed it off. "He's harmless," she'd said, laughing it off as though it were no big deal. But it was a big deal. It wasn't just about his stupid advances. It was about the fact that he'd planted a seed of doubt in our marriage. And as much as I hated to admit it, that seed was starting to grow. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the little changes. Grace coming home later than usual, her distracted tone when we talked, the way she'd suddenly light up when her phone buzzed. I told myself it was just work stress. She was a project manager after all. Deadlines and demands were part of the job. But deep down, my gut was already whispering to me, warning me that something was off. You see, Grace wasn't the type to keep secrets, or so I thought. We'd always had this unspoken rule. No matter how hard life got, we'd face it together. But lately, she seemed distant, like she was living a part of her life I wasn't invited into. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself I was overthinking things. But the truth has a way of creeping into your mind, doesn't it? Still, I pushed the thoughts aside. After all, we were a team, right? And if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that Grace loved me. Or at least, I thought she did. I didn't know it then, but the storm was already brewing. And soon, it would tear through my life, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. That evening started like any other, or at least it seemed to. I got home a little later than usual, expecting to find Grace in the kitchen, maybe humming one of her favorite tunes as the smell of dinner filled the house. That's how it always was. Her laughter, her energy, it made the place feel like home. But not that night. The house was silent, almost eerily so. No clattering of pans, no aroma of spices wafting through the air. She wasn't there. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe she had a late meeting or stopped by the grocery store on her way home. Grace always kept herself busy. That's one of the things I admired about her. Still, something didn't sit right. I couldn't explain it, but the quiet felt heavier than usual, like the house was holding its breath. I picked up my phone to call her, my thumb hovering over her name, when it buzzed in my hand. Her name lit up the screen. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Still at the office?" "Yeah, but I'm on my way home now," she replied. Her tone was light, almost cheerful, but there was something distant about it, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. "Should I go ahead and start dinner or order something?" I asked, masking the unease that was beginning to creep into my voice. "No need," she said quickly. "We won't have time for that tonight. I've got a surprise for you." Before I could press her for details, she hung up. Just like that. I stared at my phone, her words replaying in my head. A surprise? Grace loved surprises, but this didn't feel like one of her playful antics. Her voice had been upbeat, sure, but there was something else. an edge I couldn't quite place. For the next 20 minutes, I paced the living room like a caged animal, glancing at the clock every few seconds. The unease in my gut grew stronger, twisting into something darker, more tangible. What could she possibly mean by no time for dinner? Why the sudden secrecy? When the sound of her car pulling into the driveway finally broke the silence, I froze. My heart raced as the door opened and she stepped inside. One look at her, and my stomach dropped. Her clothes were wrinkled, her stockings were gone, her makeup smudged, and her hair, usually so perfectly styled, was a tangled mess. She looked like she'd been through a whirlwind. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. "Tough day?" I asked, my voice steady, though my eyes were scanning her for any clue as to what had happened. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to me and wrapped her arms around me in a hug that felt different. It was tighter, longer, almost desperate. Then she leaned in close and whispered, "You know I love you more than anything, right? You'd do anything for me, wouldn't you?" I nodded automatically, my mind racing. What was she talking about? Grace didn't do cryptic. She was straightforward, always telling me exactly what she needed or wanted. But this was something else entirely. She pulled back, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment I saw something there. Guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. Then she started talking, her words tumbling out in a way that made my chest tighten. "Victor and I have been having these conversations," she began, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "About relationships, about roles. He's been sharing his thoughts on how some relationships are stronger when the man takes a back seat, when he lets the woman take the lead." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Victor? Conversations? Since when did her boss have anything to say about our marriage? "You know, Ethan," she continued, her tone growing more thoughtful, "you always let me make a lot of the little decisions, vacations, dinners, and I appreciate that so much. But Victor, he thinks relationships work better when the man, well, when he's less in control." The way she said it, like it was some revolutionary idea, made my stomach churn. This wasn't Grace talking. This was Victor's voice, his philosophy, twisting its way into her mind. "Is that what this is leading to, Grace?" I asked slowly, trying to keep my voice calm even though my chest felt like it was about to explode. "What exactly are you trying to say?" She hesitated, and that hesitation was like a knife to the gut. Whatever she was about to say, I knew it wasn't going to be good. "Victor has been direct with me lately," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's confident, sure of himself, and it's hard to ignore. I know it's wrong, but I got caught up in it. It's been exciting." Exciting. That word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. And that was when I knew. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the beginning of the end. "Exciting?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. That single word felt like a hammer to the chest, shattering the foundation of everything I thought I knew about Grace, about us. My mind raced as I searched her face for some hint that this was a bad joke, that she'd laugh and tell me I was overreacting. But there was no laughter, no humor, just a strange, almost pleading look in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her words rushing out now like she needed to get them over with. "Victor has just been different. The way he talks about relationships, about passion. It's like he's opened my eyes to something I didn't even know I was missing." Her words felt like acid, eating away at my composure. "Missing?" I echoed, my voice rising slightly. "What exactly are you saying, Grace? That our marriage isn't enough for you?" She flinched at my tone, but didn't back down. "No, that's not it. Ethan, I love you. You're my husband, my partner. But Victor makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. He's confident, assertive. He knows what he wants, and he doesn't apologize for it. It's intoxicating. I stared at her, struggling to reconcile the woman in front of me with the Grace I thought I knew. So what? You've fallen for your boss? You're throwing away everything we've built for some office fling? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It's not like that. I haven't slept with him, I swear. But we've talked, and I've thought about it. And then he brought up something that could change everything. I felt a cold chill crawl down my spine. What did he bring up, Grace? She hesitated, her hands wringing nervously. Then she looked at me, her gaze steady despite the turmoil in her expression. He said that maybe you'd be open to it, to us trying something new. It took a moment for her words to sink in, and when they did, my chest tightened with disbelief. Trying something new? I said slowly. Grace, are you seriously suggesting what I think you are? She nodded, and the room seemed to tilt. I know it sounds crazy, she said quickly, her voice tinged with desperation. But Victor thinks it could actually bring us closer. He says that couples who explore these kinds of experiences come out stronger, more connected. He believes it could reignite something in us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife, the woman I'd built a life with, was standing in front of me, telling me she wanted to bring another man into our marriage. Not just any man, but her boss. My mind reeled as I tried to process the sheer audacity of it. And you believe him? I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. You think bringing Victor into our marriage is going to make us stronger? I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking. But I think it could. I think it's worth exploring. I shook my head, stepping back as if the distance might somehow lessen the blow. Grace, do you even hear yourself? This isn't just some experiment. This is our marriage, our life. And you're willing to risk it all for what? For some twisted fantasy your boss has been feeding you? Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might backpedal, might realize how insane this all sounded. But then she spoke again, her voice soft but unwavering. He's outside, she said, in the driveway. He wants to talk to you. The room seemed to go silent, her words echoing in my head. Victor was here, in my driveway. As if this were all perfectly normal, as if it were something we could just sit down and discuss over coffee. My stomach churned with a mix of rage and disgust. You invited him here? I said, my voice dangerously low. I thought if you talked to him, you'd understand, she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Maybe you'd see what I see. I stared at her, barely able to contain the storm of emotions raging inside me. You want me to talk to him? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Fine, I'll talk to him. Her face lit up with hope, but she didn't understand. She had no idea what kind of conversation I had in mind. Without another word, I turned and headed for the door, my fists clenched at my sides. If Victor thought he could waltz into my marriage, he was about to learn a very painful lesson. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging inside. There he was, Victor, sitting in his shiny black car like he owned the world, casually scrolling through his phone as if this was just another day at the office. My jaw clenched, and my fists tightened. How could he sit there so smug, so sure of himself after everything he'd done? After everything he'd said to Grace? He didn't even notice me approach at first. Too busy with his screen, no doubt basking in the glow of his own self-importance. When he finally looked up and saw me, he had the audacity to smirk. That damn smirk. The kind of look that says, I've already won. So, he said, rolling down his window. His voice was smooth, dripping with arrogance. Grace filled you in, huh? I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to speak just yet. The rage boiling inside me threatened to spill over, and I needed to keep my head clear. But he took my silence as an invitation to keep talking. "Look, Ethan," he said, leaning back in his seat like we were old friends. "I get it. This is a big adjustment. But once you open your mind to it, you'll see how much better things can be. Grace told me you're a good guy, supportive, understanding. The kind of man who wants his wife to be happy. That's what this is all about, making her happy." My vision blurred and my hands shook. Was this guy for real? He was sitting in my driveway, talking about my wife like she was some kind of project he was fixing. Like our marriage was his to mold and shape as he pleased. "Don't worry," he continued, flashing that smug grin again. "You can still have her. I'm not trying to take her away. This is about sharing, about exploring new—" That was it, I snapped. Before he could finish his sentence, my fist connected with his nose. The sound of the impact was sharp, followed by the sickening crunch of bone. Victor's head snapped back against the seat, and for a moment he looked stunned, his hand flying up to his face as blood began to pour from his nostrils. "What the hell?" he gasped, his voice muffled as he clutched at his nose. I didn't answer. I grabbed a dish towel from the toolbox I'd left on the porch earlier and tossed it at him. "You're going to need this," I said coldly. Victor tried to sit up, but before he could, I yanked the door open and forced his free hand behind the headrest, securing it with a zip tie. He struggled, cursing under his breath, but he was no match for my adrenaline-fueled strength. With his other hand still holding the towel to his nose, he was defenseless. "Ethan, this is crazy," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't—" I silenced him with a second punch, this one aimed at his gut. He doubled over as much as the restraints allowed, gasping for air, his arrogance finally replaced by fear. "This is what a real alpha looks like," I spat, leaning in close. "Not some loudmouthed coward who thinks he can walk into another man's life and take what isn't his." Victor's eyes widened, and I could see the panic setting in. He opened his mouth to speak, but I wasn't finished. I reached for the heavy garden hose nozzle lying nearby and brought it down hard on the side window. The glass shattered, shards flying everywhere. The sound was deafening, but I didn't care. I smashed the windshield next, watching as cracks spread across the surface like a spider's web. "Ethan, stop," he begged, his voice trembling. "I'll leave, okay? I'll stay away from Grace. Just please stop." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. I wasn't done making my point. Moving to the front of the car, I swung the nozzle at the headlights, shattering them one by one. Each blow sent a rush of satisfaction through me, like I was reclaiming some part of myself he'd tried to steal. When I finally stopped, I was breathing hard, my hands shaking. I walked back to the driver's side, where Victor sat slumped in his seat, his face pale and bloodied. His once pristine suit was torn, and shards of glass glittered in his lap. I pulled the carving knife from my back pocket and pressed it lightly against his throat, just enough to get his attention. His eyes widened, and he froze, too terrified to speak. "Listen to me, Victor," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm not going to finish you. Not tonight. But if I see a single word about this in a police report, if I so much as hear your name again, I'll find you. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year. But one day, when you least expect it, I'll finish what I started here. Do you understand me?" He nodded frantically, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. I stabbed the knife into the seat beside him, letting it sink deep into the leather. "Grace is going to need this to cut you loose," I said. "Drive her far away, take her to the hospital, I don't care. But if I ever see either of you again, it won't end well." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked back to the house. My heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. As I shut the door behind me, I heard Grace calling from upstairs. "Victor, did you and Ethan talk things out?" Her voice was light, almost casual, as if she hadn't just shattered everything we'd built together. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. She had no idea what kind of chaos she'd unleashed. Yeah, I called back, my voice flat. We talked. He's still outside. You should go see him. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the stairs where Grace's voice had come from. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. The betrayal, the rage, the disbelief. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend how we'd gotten here. How the woman I'd loved and trusted could so casually suggest something that turned our marriage into a mockery. Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing nothing but a silk robe I'd bought her years ago, the kind of thing that once drove me wild. Tonight, though, it made my stomach turn. She looked down at me, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral, like she was trying to read the room. "Did you tell him it's fine?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of her question. Fine? Did she honestly think anything about this situation could be fine? Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. "I made it clear what's going to happen," I said evenly. "He's outside waiting for you." She tilted her head, frowning slightly. "What do you mean, Ethan? What's going to happen?" "You should go see him," I said, stepping aside to let her pass. "He's expecting you." For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as if sensing something was off, but she didn't press me. Instead, she adjusted her robe and walked past me, her perfume lingering in the air as she headed for the front door. The second the door closed behind her, I moved. My steps were quick, purposeful, as I made my way upstairs to our bedroom. The sight of her lingerie, her carefully arranged jewelry, and the framed photos of us on the nightstand ignited something in me. I pulled an empty suitcase from the closet and began throwing her things into it. Clothes, shoes, toiletries, anything that belonged to her went in without a second thought. I wasn't careful. I didn't bother folding or sorting. I wasn't in the mood for neatness. This wasn't about packing. This was about erasing her presence from the house. A bottle of perfume shattered as it hit the bottom of the suitcase, its sharp floral scent filling the air. I barely noticed. Once the suitcase was full, I dragged it to the guest room window. Below, I could see Grace standing by Victor's car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the knife I'd left for her. She was trying to cut him free, but her movements were clumsy, panicked. She kept glancing back at the house, her face pale and drawn. "Grace!" I shouted, throwing open the window. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide. "You're going to need this." I shoved the suitcase through the window. It hit the driveway with a heavy thud, the sound of breaking glass echoing in the quiet night. One of her shoes followed, landing just inches from her feet. She flinched, staring up at me with a mix of shock and disbelief. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she called, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" I leaned out the window, my voice cold and steady. "Isn't this what you wanted, Grace? You made it clear you'd rather be with him. So go. Take your Alpha and drive off into the sunset." Her face crumpled, and I saw tears start to fall. "Ethan, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought this was something we could explore together, something that would bring us closer." "Closer?" I spat, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You think dragging another man into our marriage would bring us closer? Do you even hear yourself?" She sobbed harder, clutching the suitcase as if it could somehow anchor her. "I made a mistake, Ethan, a huge mistake. But we can fix this. I love you. Please, let's talk." I shook my head, my jaw tightening. "We're past talking, Grace. You've already shown me exactly how much respect you have for this marriage. For me. And I'm done." I turned from the window and headed back downstairs, ignoring her muffled cries as they grew louder. I grabbed her purse from the counter and opened the front door, tossing it at her feet. "Here," I said curtly. "You'll need this too." Her sobs hitched as she bent to pick it up. "Ethan, please," she pleaded. "Don't do this. I love you. I'll do anything to fix this. Just give me a chance." I stood in the doorway staring down at her. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe. But it was quickly snuffed out by the memory of her words, of the betrayal that had brought us to this point. "You already made your choice, Grace," I said quietly. "Now live with it." I shut the door, the sound of the lock clicking into place reverberating through the house. Leaning against the door, I could still hear her muffled cries, her desperate pleas for me to come back out, to let her explain. But I was done listening. I walked to the kitchen, grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, and sat at the table. The adrenaline was wearing off now, replaced by a hollow ache. Through the window, I watched as Grace finally managed to free Victor. He collapsed into the back seat, bloodied and bruised, while she slid into the driver's seat. She glanced back at the house one last time, her eyes red and full of regret, before pulling out of the driveway. I watched them drive away, my hands gripping the beer bottle so tightly I thought it might shatter. The woman I loved was gone, and everything we'd built together lay in ruins. And yet, for the first time in a long time, I felt strangely free. After they drove off, the house fell silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence I used to enjoy when Grace and I were simply spending time in different rooms. No, this was a heavier, suffocating quiet, the kind that presses down on you, amplifying every thought. My mind raced with fragments of what had just happened. Her words, Victor's smug face, the sound of glass shattering. It felt surreal, like I'd just stepped out of someone else's nightmare. But this was my life now. And if Grace thought she could come back and undo the damage, she was wrong. She'd crossed a line that no amount of apologies could erase. The next morning, I woke up early. Sleep had been elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, pleading, tear-streaked, full of regret. But it wasn't enough. Regret doesn't rebuild trust. Regret doesn't erase betrayal. I needed to take control of the situation. If Grace thought she could cry her way back into my life, she had another thing coming. I grabbed my phone and sent her a message. Simple, direct. "Don't come back. Your things will be ready for you to pick up tomorrow. After that, we're done." It took less than a minute for her to respond. "Ethan, please, let's talk. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I love you. We can fix this." Fix this. As if this were some minor misunderstanding, like forgetting to take the trash out. My jaw tightened as I stared at her message. She still didn't get it. I ignored her and went about the task of clearing out the house. Her clothes, her shoes, her hair products that took up most of the bathroom counter, it all had to go. I packed everything methodically, making sure not to leave a single trace of her behind. By the time I was done, the house looked like it belonged to someone else, like the past 5 years had never happened. The next day, Grace showed up exactly when I told her to. I saw her car pull into the driveway, but I didn't go out to meet her. Instead, I watched from the window as she stepped out, looking far worse than the last time I saw her. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale and blotchy from crying, and she moved like someone carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the doorbell before finally pressing it. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and grating. I didn't rush to answer. Let her wait. Let her feel the weight of what she'd done. When I finally opened the door, her eyes lit up with hope, but I shut it down with a single glance. "Your things are in the garage," I said coldly, stepping aside to let her in. "Ethan, please," she began, her voice shaky. "Can we talk? I need to explain." I cut her off with a sharp wave of my hand. "There's nothing to explain, Grace. You made your choice when you invited him into our marriage. This isn't something we come back from." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she clutched her hands together as if she were physically holding herself together. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "I see that now. I got caught up in something I didn't understand, and I let him manipulate me. But I never stopped loving you, Ethan. I need you to know that. Loving me isn't the issue, Grace, I said, my tone calm but firm. You didn't respect me. You didn't respect us. And without respect, there's nothing to build on. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. Don't, I said, my voice cutting through her protests. You're not here to plead your case. You're here to collect your things and go. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked completely defeated. But then her eyes hardened, and I saw a flicker of the Grace I once knew, the woman who fought for what she wanted. You're throwing away everything we've built over one mistake, she said, her voice laced with desperation. I can fix this, Ethan. I can make it right. I shook my head, my jaw tightening. You can't fix this, Grace. You can't unring the bell. And honestly, I'm not sure I want you to. Her face crumpled and the tears spilled over, but I didn't move to comfort her. Instead, I walked past her, heading for the garage. Your things are in here, I said, opening the door and gesturing to the neatly packed boxes stacked against the wall. Take them and go. She followed me, her footsteps hesitant, her sobs quiet but persistent. As she stood in the doorway, staring at the boxes, I felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe. But it wasn't enough to change my mind. She turned to me, her eyes red and swollen. Ethan, please, she whispered. I'll do anything. Just give me one more chance. I met her gaze, my expression cold and unyielding. You had your chance, Grace, and you threw it away. She didn't respond. Instead, she picked up the nearest box, her hands trembling, and carried it to her car. I watched as she made trip after trip, each one chipping away at the life we'd built together. When the last box was loaded, she turned to me one final time. Goodbye, Ethan, she said, her voice barely audible. Goodbye, Grace, I replied, my tone flat. And with that, she drove away, leaving me alone in the driveway, surrounded by the silence she'd left behind. The days that followed were strange, almost surreal. The house felt emptier than ever, not just physically, but emotionally. I thought I'd feel relief, freedom, maybe. But what I felt most was an odd kind of numbness. The routine of our shared life had been shattered, leaving behind an unsettling quiet. I knew Grace would try to reach out again. That was inevitable. Sure enough, the calls started within 2 days. At first I ignored them, letting her voicemails pile up without bothering to listen. But her persistence didn't waver. Messages flooded in. Please, apologies, promises that things would be different. On the 5th day, she sent a text that caught my attention. Ethan, I need to see you, please. One conversation. If you never want to hear from me again after that, I'll respect it. But I owe you an explanation. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to shut the door on her completely. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I fell in love with, wanted answers. Finally, I replied, Come by in an hour. We'll talk. She arrived on time, parking in the same spot she had countless times before, though this time she sat in the car for a moment, as if gathering her courage. When she finally stepped out, she looked exhausted. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale and worn, and her eyes were swollen from crying. This wasn't the confident, vibrant Grace I once knew. This was someone broken by her own choices. She walked up to the porch where I was sitting, hesitating before lowering herself onto the steps beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, she broke it. I don't know where to start, she said, her voice trembling. Start with why, I said coldly, staring straight ahead. Why him? Why any of this? She took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Victor got into my head, she admitted. At first, it was just harmless conversations, work stuff, small talk. But then he started saying things that made me question everything. He talked about relationships, about how most men aren't real leaders. He made me feel like maybe I was missing out on something. I clenched my jaw, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. And you believed him? You believed that blowhard over me? Her eyes filled with tears and she nodded. I don't know why. Maybe it was his confidence, the way he seemed so sure of himself. It was intoxicating, Ethan. And for a moment, I let myself get caught up in it. But I swear to you, I never stopped loving you. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why bring him into our marriage? I snapped, finally turning to look at her. Why suggest something so insane? She flinched at the sharpness in my tone, but didn't look away. I thought it might help us, she said quietly. Victor made it sound like it would bring us closer, like it would reignite something we'd lost. I was stupid, Ethan. I see that now. Stupid doesn't even begin to cover it, I said, my voice cold. You let him manipulate you. You let him poison everything we built together. And for what? A fantasy? Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. It wasn't real. None of it was real. After you confronted him, he fired me. Said he didn't want anything more to do with me. And you were right, Ethan. He's a coward. A manipulative, arrogant coward. I raised an eyebrow, letting the sarcasm seep into my voice. Well, at least he did one thing right. She let out a weak, humorless laugh, wiping her eyes. I don't blame you for hating me, she said. I hate myself for what I've done. But I want to fix this, Ethan. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on me. You can't fix this, Grace. You broke something that doesn't just get put back together. Trust, respect, that's the foundation of a marriage, and you tore it apart. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I still love you. I've always loved you. Please, Ethan, let me prove it to you. I stared at her, the woman I'd once planned to spend my life with, and felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. Maybe you do love me, I said finally, but love isn't enough. Not anymore. Her face crumpled and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it wasn't enough to sway me. She'd made her choice, and now I had to make mine. We're done, Grace, I said quietly but firmly. There's no going back. Her sobs grew louder, but I stood, my decision made. I walked back into the house, leaving her on the porch, her tears echoing in the quiet night. I didn't look back. The days following that conversation were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet reflection. Deciding to end a marriage wasn't something I'd ever thought I'd face. But here I was, standing at the edge of a life I'd spent years building with Grace, ready to let it all go. The morning after she left my porch, I contacted a divorce lawyer. It was a cold, sobering process. Filling out forms, detailing assets, and untangling years of shared commitments felt like erasing parts of myself. Yet, as difficult as it was, I knew it was necessary. Trust, once shattered, doesn't rebuild itself. And I wasn't about to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next betrayal. Grace continued to reach out, her messages swinging wildly between pleading apologies and desperate promises. I ignored most of them, but when I did respond, it was brief, to the point. We're done. The paperwork is being filed. Focus on moving forward just like I'm doing. She didn't take it well. I expected that. But her reaction didn't change my resolve. A week later, I met her for the final time to divide the last of our belongings. We agreed to sell the house and split the savings. She kept her car, and I kept mine. The house, which once felt like a home, now felt like a hollow shell, a monument to what we'd lost. Walking through it one last time, I was struck by how empty it felt, even with the furniture still in place. It was a physical manifestation of what our marriage had become. Grace arrived exactly on time, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. She'd clearly been crying, though she tried to put on a brave face. She stepped into the house as if she were walking into a graveyard, her movements hesitant and uncertain. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for meeting me." I nodded, keeping my distance. "Let's get this over with." We walked through the house, dividing up what was left. It was a sterile, mechanical process, devoid of the warmth and laughter that once filled these walls. The dining table where we'd shared countless meals, the couch where we'd binge-watched our favorite shows, even the bed we once shared. All of it was now just stuff to be sorted and assigned. At one point, Grace paused, picking up a framed photo of the two of us on our honeymoon. We were smiling, carefree, blissfully unaware of the future that awaited us. She stared at it for a long time before setting it down with trembling hands. "I never wanted this, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted us to end." "Then you should have thought about that before you brought him into our marriage," I replied coldly. "You made your choice, Grace, and now we're here." Her tears started again, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. I'd already given her everything I had, and she'd thrown it away. When everything was finally sorted, and she was ready to leave, she turned to me one last time. "Ethan, I know you don't believe me, but I'll regret this for the rest of my life. I'll always love you." I looked at her, the woman who had once been my partner, my confidant, my everything. "Maybe you will, Grace," I said quietly. "But love isn't enough. Not anymore." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and walked out the door. I watched her drive away, her car disappearing down the street, taking the last remnants of our life together with her. For the first time in weeks, the house was completely silent. No calls, no messages, no tears. Just quiet. I sat in the empty living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and let the reality of it all sink in. It wasn't the future I'd planned, but it was the one I had now. And in a strange way, it felt freeing. There was no more waiting for the other shoe to drop, no more second-guessing every word and action. I was alone, but I was at peace. I started making plans to move out of the house, to leave behind the memories that had once defined my life. A new apartment, a fresh start. It was daunting, but also exciting in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never let myself be anyone's second choice again. As I locked the door for the final time, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The past was behind me, and a new chapter was waiting to be written. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it.